With regard to the commandment, you shall not covet, one distinctive feature of that commandment is the difference in tradition between Protestants and Catholics. Traditionally, Protestants have as the 10th commandment a single commandment that says, you shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. On the other hand, the Catholic tradition has two commandments regarding coveting. The 9th commandment being, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And the reason for that, as I said in the introductory video to this series, is because the Protestants traditionally take their numbering of the 10 Commandments from the 20th chapter of the book of Exodus, when Moses receives the commandments on Mount Sinai. Catholics, on the other hand, take their numbering of the 10 Commandments from the 5th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, in which the presentation of the 10 Commandments there is called the Decalogue. And it is in the book of Deuteronomy that we see the split between the two commandments regarding you shall not covet. Now, the book of Deuteronomy, while it is the last book of the Pentateuch and is part of the tradition of the Mosaic law, the law of Moses, it was not necessarily written by Moses himself, because there are distinctive differences between the literary style and language of the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy. And many scholars agree that the book of Deuteronomy was written after the people of Israel had been an established nation and had occupied the Promised Land for a couple of centuries. But it is a product of a very important historical development in the history of Israel, which is called the Deuteronomic Reform, which took place in 622 BC. Briefly, after the death of King Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split as a united kingdom, in which 10 tribes broke away from the reign of David's family and the capital in Jerusalem and the temple, and formed the northern kingdom of Israel, which consisted of 10 of the 12 tribes. 2 tribes remained in the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah, whose inhabitants came to be known as the Jews, or the Jewish people, and remained united with the temple and the reign of King David's family. This occurred in 922 BC, but just 200 years after that, the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC was overrun and conquered by the empire of Assyria, and those 10 tribes disappeared into history, becoming the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom survived that onslaught, and after the fall of the empire of Assyria, the southern kingdom underwent a reform, a major religious reform, which is known as the Deuteronomic Reform, under the reign of King Josiah in the year 622 BC. And during that reform, a number of practices became more universally observed in the Jewish faith, not the least of which is the practice of Passover and the centrality of temple worship for the nation. But also a product of this reform is the book of Deuteronomy. But what we see in the Decalogue, as opposed to the 10 Commandments as presented in the book of Exodus, is a progression in social thought and consciousness that is seen in the basic commandment, you shall not covet. And where in the book of Exodus combines the role of the spouse, and in this particular case the role of the wife, with the goods of a person, in the book of Deuteronomy we see a progression in which the spouse, or in this case the wife, is no longer lumped or associated with the property and the goods of a person. And it is from that tradition that the Catholic Church develops its numbering and its presentation of the 10 Commandments. The book of Exodus declares, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or ass, or anything else that belongs to him. The book of Deuteronomy, however, reads, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet or desire your neighbor's house or field, nor his male or female slave, nor his ox or ass, or anything that belongs to him. So you can see right there in the command from the book of Deuteronomy a reference to the people being an established nation for quite some time, because it makes a reference to you shall not covet your neighbor's field. Whereas in the book of Exodus, they were wandering in the desert. They only had their tent and their dwelling place or their house. But here, it's their house and their field. Now, I have to admit, as a Catholic and a somewhat patriotic Catholic, I personally prefer the numbering and presentation in the book of Deuteronomy. But also because you do see in this the cultural adjusting in attitude with regard to the role of the wife in relation to her husband, as opposed to the person's relation to his goods, in that the wife is no longer seen as part of the property of someone. And that is reflected in a commandment having to do with respect for another's spouse, as distinct from respect for someone else's goods. And in this commandment, we see God addressing an interior disposition that we are all called to have as His holy people, a disposition that will lead us to right living and ultimately adherence to all the other commandments that He presents to us in the 10 Commandments of the book of Exodus and in the Decalogue as presented in the book of Deuteronomy.